Hey guys, tonight we're going to the Pacific Theater, 1945, to witness one of the most famous and brutal battles of World War II, the Battle of Iwo Jima. Think of it like the world's worst beach vacation, no sunscreen, no margaritas, and way too many machine guns. On one side, you've got the United States Marine Corps, armed to the teeth and backed by overwhelming naval firepower. On the other, Japan, dug deep into volcanic rock and ready to fight to the last man literally because surrender was not on their menu. Why are these two fighting over a tiny speck of an island's simple location? Location. Iwo Jima sits perfectly between US bomber bases in the Mariana Islands and mainland Japan. For America, capturing it meant safer bombing runs and a place for damaged planes to land. For Japan, losing it meant their homeland was suddenly within easy reach of American B-29 bombers. Basically, it's a deadly game of real estate chess, and nobody's playing nice. The spark, by February 1945, Japan's navy was crippled and its air force was running on fumes. The US saw an opening and decided to strike hard. The plan looked straightforward on paper: bomb the island, storm the beaches, plant the flag, and move on. Spoiler alert, nothing went that smoothly. Over 70,000 Marines would land on Iwo Jima to face roughly 21,000 Japanese defenders. By the end, nearly 7,000 Americans and virtually every Japanese soldier would be dead. It was less a battle and more a slow, grinding meat grinder with sin. But here's what makes this battle so weirdly fascinating: the irony. The US underestimated the island's defenses, while the Japanese had spent months underground, turning Iwo Jima into a volcanic ant farm of doom. Marines expected a fast win. Instead, they walked into a nightmare that even horror directors would call a bit much. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Did you know about this battle before? If not, drop a comment after you hear how it really went down. Ready? Let's drop into tonight's story. Things are about to get weird. The morning of February 19th, 1945 was deceptively beautiful. The sky was clear, the sea calm, and the smell of sulfur, yes. Literal sulfur filled the air. Iwo Jima wasn't just any island. It was basically a giant, smelly volcano. As the sun rose, the US Navy unleashed a 3-day bombardment, pounding the island with more shells than a particularly angry seafood restaurant. Soldiers on board the troop ships cheered. Surely nothing could survive that kind of firepower, right? Wrong. When the first wave of Marines hit the beaches, they expected scattered resistance, maybe a few snipers. Instead, they found nothing. It was eerie. The black volcanic sand was thick and clung to everything, making it hard to run, dig, or even stand upright. Marines began to wonder if the bombardment had worked better than expected. Maybe the Japanese were all dead or hiding somewhere having a tea break. Then the sky erupted. From hidden pillboxes, camouflaged bunkers, and underground tunnels, the Japanese defenders opened fire with everything they had. Machine guns, mortars, artillery, you name it. One moment the beach was quiet, the next it was a blender of hot metal and confusion. Marines dove for cover, only to discover there wasn't much cover to dive into. The black sand just swallowed their bodies, offering no protection. A Marine later compared it to trying to dig a foxhole in a bag of marbles. General Kuribayashi, the Japanese commander, had been clever. Instead of defending the shoreline, he'd let the Americans land all of them and then unleashed coordinated crossfire once the beach was packed with targets. It was like inviting someone into your house and then dropping a piano on them when they sit down. Marines who had trained for heroic, movie-style charges found themselves pinned down, desperately trying to survive while calling in naval support. Meanwhile, the ships offshore were blasting away blindly, trying not to hit their own men. At one point, a destroyer accidentally shelled an area still full of Marines. The radio man's actual message to HQ reportedly included the phrase, "Oops, our bad." Historians still argue whether that was a mistranslation or just painfully honest. By the end of the first day, about 30,000 Marines had landed, but the cost was staggering. Progress was measured in feet, not miles. A Marine might fight for hours just to gain the length of a football field and then lose half his squad doing it. The beach, once black and pristine, was now a chaotic mess of wrecked tanks, dead men, and abandoned gear. One bizarre nugget from that day, some Marines swore they saw enemy soldiers popping up out of nowhere like volcanic ninjas. Turns out the Japanese tunnel system was so extensive that entire units could vanish underground, travel unseen. and then attack from behind. It was like playing a deadly game of whack-a-mole, except the moles had bayonets and a serious grudge. As night fell, the Marines dug in or tried to. The volcanic sand made proper trenches nearly impossible. Sleep was out of the question anyway. Sporadic sniper fire and sudden banzai charges kept everyone on edge, somewhere deep underground. Suribachi was calmly sipping tea, probably thinking, Phase 1, complete. The Americans, meanwhile, were stunned. Their intelligence had been wrong, their bombardment had done almost nothing, and the easy beach landing they'd been promised, yeah, that was officially a lie. The Battle of Iwo Jima had only just begun, and already, it felt like a nightmare no one could wake up from. The sun rose on February 20th like it hadn't read the room. Bright, warm, and blissfully unaware that the beach below looked like a cross between a scrapyard and a war crime. The Marines, exhausted from their first night on Iwo Jima, blinked at the daylight and probably muttered something along the lines of, "Oh great, we're still here." From offshore, battleships and cruisers continued their relentless pounding of the island, each shell screaming through the air like a banshee before exploding in a spectacular display of smoke and flying debris. To anyone watching, it looked like the Japanese defenders had to be toast by now, just crispy little soldiers clinging to their melted machine guns. Except they weren't toast, they were underground, drinking tea, possibly laughing. Here's the thing, Iwo Jima wasn't just an island, it was a natural fortress. Its volcanic terrain created caves, ridges, and craters perfect for defense. General Suribachi, who had studied in America before the war and had a flair for unorthodox thinking, took one look at this sulfur-stinking rock and said, "You know what? We're not going to fight them on the beach like amateurs, we're going to disappear." And disappear they did. The Japanese had spent months building an elaborate network of tunnels and bunkers, stretching over 11 miles beneath the island. These weren't just holes in the ground, they were interconnected, reinforced strongholds with supplies, command posts, and even hospitals. Imagine an evil underground mall, except instead of a food court, there's a machine gun nest. The result when the Marines attacked, they were fighting ghosts. A bunker might seem abandoned, only to come alive with gunfire the moment someone turned their back. The phrase from nowhere became a daily part of Marine vocabulary. The terrain added to the nightmare. The volcanic ash that made the beaches so hard to cross didn't stop inland. It clung to boots, gummed up vehicles, and turned every movement into a grueling slog. Even tanks struggled, their treads sinking like they were stuck in warm pudding. One Marine described it as walking uphill, both ways, through hell. The smell didn't help either. The island's natural sulfur vents made everything reek like rotten eggs. Soldiers joked that they didn't need to find the enemy, they could just follow the stench. Unfortunately, the stench was everywhere. Even the Marines' coffee tasted faintly like brimstone, which might be the saddest thing to happen to coffee in the entire war. Despite the terrain, the Marines pushed forward, inch by bloody inch. They relied heavily on flamethrowers to clear out bunkers, which sounds impressive until you realize that flamethrowers are basically a guy with a backpack full of highly flammable liquid saying, "Please don't shoot me." These poor souls had to walk right up to enemy strongholds and spray fire into the openings, all while dodging bullets and grenades. Casualties among flamethrower operators were, unsurprisingly, catastrophic. At one point, a group of Marines managed to capture a heavily fortified pillbox, only to realize it was connected to 3 other bunkers via tunnels. Suddenly, gunfire erupted from behind them, and they were forced to fight their way back out of the same position they'd just taken. It was like winning a prize at a carnival, only to discover it was rigged and you owed the carnies more money than you started with. Suribachi's tactics were brilliant in their cruelty. Instead of wasting lives on banzai charges, those famous suicidal rushes Japan had used in earlier battles, he forbade them entirely. His orders were clear: fight smart, fight slow, and inflict maximum casualties. Every inch of ground would be paid for in blood. And it worked. By the end of the second day, American losses were piling up far faster than expected. One odd bit of trivia: the Japanese defenders used the island's natural vents to channel smoke from their fires and cooking areas away from detection. This meant they could literally have a hot meal underground while the Marines above were subsisting on cold rations and sheer rage. Marines swore they could smell rice cooking in the middle of firefights, which had to be one of the most surreal sensory experiences imaginable. The American command, led by General Holland Howland Mad Smith, realized they were up against something far nastier than anticipated. Smith, known for his fiery temper and colorful vocabulary, reportedly had an outburst so loud that nearby radio operators thought there was a transmission issue. His solution was simple: more firepower, more bombs, more artillery, more everything. If the enemy wanted to hide underground, Smith would just bury them deeper. But there was a problem. The Japanese positions were so well camouflaged that identifying targets was nearly impossible. Marines would radio in coordinates for airstrikes, only to watch bombs fall harmlessly on empty patches of rock while the real danger remained untouched. It was like trying to swat a mosquito with a sledgehammer, spectacularly destructive but rarely accurate. As night fell on the second day, the island glowed with fire and smoke. Sporadic fighting continued in the darkness, with flares lighting up the battlefield like twisted fireworks. Marines tried to sleep in shallow foxholes, if you could call them that, while snipers patiently picked off anyone careless enough to silhouette themselves against the moonlight. Somewhere deep in his underground command post, Kuribayashi reviewed maps and calmly planned the next phase. He knew he couldn't win. Japan's navy was gone, and no reinforcements were coming. His goal wasn't victory. It was to make the Americans bleed so heavily that they would question invading Japan itself. In that sense, every Marine casualty was a strategic success. Historians still debate whether Kuribayashi's tactics were purely defensive genius or borderline sadistic. Was he a master strategist or just a man determined to drag everyone down with him? The truth probably lies somewhere in between. What's certain is that his plan was working. The island was a trap, and the USE had walked right into it. By the end of day 2, the Marines had captured a few hundred yards of territory at staggering cost. Mount Suribachi, the island's dominant feature, loomed ominously in the distance, its volcanic slopes riddled with hidden gun emplacements. It was like staring at a haunted mountain that wanted you dead. The Marines knew they had to take it. The question was whether they could survive the climb. By day 3, it was clear that the Battle of Iwo Jima wasn't going to be the quick, heroic dash that the US command had advertised. In the pre-invasion briefings, Marines were told the island would fall in about a week. A week at this point. They'd have settled for just crossing the beach without tripping over bodies or sinking into volcanic sand. General Holland Howland Mad Smith was fuming on his command ship. He'd expected overwhelming firepower to crush the defenders. After all, the US Navy had pounded Iwo Jima for 3 days straight before the landings, hurling more explosives than most small countries use in a year. By now, according to the plan, there shouldn't have been a single functioning Japanese gun left on the island. Instead, his Marines were dying by the hundreds, while the enemy remained eerily intact like an army of very polite, very deadly ghosts. The truth was, General Kuribayashi's defense plan was one of the boldest gambles of the war. Unlike his predecessors, who often relied on dramatic bonsai charges, Kuribayashi banned such tactics outright. No pointless dying, he told his men, which was quite a revolutionary concept for the Imperial Japanese Army. His orders were clear: fight smart, fight hidden, and make the Americans pay dearly for every foot of ground. So instead of charging out of tunnels screaming, the Japanese defenders stayed invisible until the perfect moment. The tunnels themselves were masterpieces of grim engineering. Some ran 75 feet below the surface. With reinforced concrete walls and interconnecting passageways, entire platoons could vanish underground, pop up behind the Marines, fire a few devastating bursts, and then melt away again. One Marine described it as fighting an enemy who was everywhere and nowhere at the same time. By now, the Americans realized Mount Suribachi wasn't just a big hill, it was the centerpiece of Kuribayashi's defense. Suribachi loomed over the southern beaches like a giant, sneering volcano. From its slopes, hidden artillery positions rained death on the landing zones below. If the Marines wanted any hope of surviving, they had to take that mountain. The problem: Suribachi didn't want to be taken. Smith called in additional bombardments, including naval gunfire so heavy that one battleship reportedly ran low on ammunition by lunchtime. But no matter how much they fired, the Japanese kept shooting back. It was like fighting a hydra cut off one head, and 2 more popped up from a different tunnel. Amid this chaos, some bizarre incidents occurred. One famous piece of trivia involves a Sherman tank that broke down in the middle of a firefight. Lacking spare parts, a group of Marines used empty ammo boxes, duct tape, and what may or may not have been a lucky rabbit's foot to patch it together. Miraculously, it worked for about 10 minutes, when the tank promptly broke down again. One exasperated crewman reportedly yelled, "Next time we ride a bicycle." Despite setbacks, the Marines pushed forward using a mix of brute force and sheer stubbornness. Flamethrowers became the weapon of the day, with Marines carrying portable infernos on their backs. It was effective but terrifying work. The operators had to run right up to enemy bunkers while everyone in the vicinity, friend and foe alike, tried not to get roasted. Close quarters combat turned surreal in one documented encounter. A Marine kicked open a bunker door only to find it filled with smoke, steam, and very confused Japanese soldiers cooking rice. Both sides froze for a heartbeat before everyone started shooting. Later, surviving Marines swore the last thing they smelled before the gunfire started was dinner. Meanwhile, Kuribayashi monitored the battle from his underground command center. He rarely communicated with Tokyo, knowing reinforcements were impossible. His focus was entirely on prolonging the fight and inflicting maximum casualties. At one point, he reportedly remarked to an aide, "Every American killed here buys another day for Japan." It was a chillingly pragmatic view of war, especially considering that he knew his own men weren't coming home either. Historians still debate whether Kuribayashi was a brilliant strategist or just a very patient sadist. Some see him as a visionary who understood modern defensive warfare better than anyone else at the time. Others think he was simply playing for time, dragging out the inevitable while sacrificing his soldiers in slow motion. The tunnels themselves remain a testament to his grim ingenuity. Many are still sealed and unexplored to this day. As the third day bled into the fourth, the Marines had finally managed to encircle Mount Suribachi. Taking it would require an all-out assault. Casualties were already staggering, and morale was stretched thin. One battalion commander reportedly told his men, "When we get to the top, I don't care what you do. Plant a flag, build a bar, whatever. Just take the damn mountain." The battle had become a grinding war of attrition, and everyone knew it. Even with overwhelming numbers and firepower, victory felt agonizingly far away. The Marines had come expecting to conquer an island. Instead, they found themselves trapped in a deadly chess match, playing against an opponent who always seemed 3 moves ahead. That night, while Marines tried to rest in their shallow foxholes, Kuribayashi moved fresh troops into position through his hidden tunnels. By morning, the mountain would erupt once more and the Americans would face a storm unlike anything they'd seen before. By day 4, the battle for Iwo Jima had settled into a grim rhythm, if you could call ducking artillery fire and charging into flamethrower range rhythm. Marines were exhausted, dirty, and developing a collective twitch every time a tunnel entrance was mentioned. Even the chaplains were starting to curse under their breath. The push toward Mount Suribachi intensified. The mountain loomed like a volcanic bully, taunting everyone below. Taking it wasn't just a tactical necessity, it had become personal. Marines wanted to drag Suribachi down just to spite it, but the Japanese defenders weren't about to hand it over. Every ridge, cave, and rocky outcrop was defended like the last slice of pizza at a family reunion. Here's where things got really up close and personal: flamethrowers and satchel charges. Imagine walking straight into a nightmare while carrying a tank of napalm on your back, knowing you were basically a moving fire hazard. That was the job of the flamethrower operators. Their mission was simple: walk up to a bunker, spray fire inside, and hope no one shot you before you did it. Marines joked grimly that the flamethrower guys were either heroes or lunatics, usually both. One bizarre and darkly humorous event occurred when a Marine accidentally ignited a tunnel entrance, causing a massive underground explosion. The blast sent debris and a surprisingly intact Japanese officer's hat flying through the air. The hat reportedly landed on a nearby bulldozer, and for a brief moment, everyone just stared at it in stunned silence before diving back into the chaos. The bulldozer driver later kept the hat as a souvenir, though he admitted it always smelled faintly of sulfur and bad luck. Close combat was brutal. Bunkers often hid multiple rooms connected by tunnels, so clearing one didn't mean it was secure. Marines would storm in, toss grenades, shoot everything that moved, and then have to repeat the process 2 more times as more enemies emerged like unwelcome party guests. Some Japanese defenders even faked death, waiting for Marines to pass before springing up with bayonets. To counter this, Marines developed a routine shoot, grenade, flame, repeat. It was methodical, exhausting, and terrifying. The toll on mental health was severe. Some veterans later admitted they started talking to the tunnels, cursing them like living enemies. One Marine recalled yelling, "You again," at a particular bunker that seemed to keep coming back to life no matter how many times it was cleared. Meanwhile, General Kuribayashi was keeping his cool underground. His plan was working. The slower the Americans advanced, the more casualties they suffered. He sent carefully timed counterattacks through the tunnels, hitting the Marines when they were most vulnerable, unlike earlier battles, where Japanese soldiers charged recklessly into certain death. These attacks were precise and calculated. It was psychological warfare as much as physical. Marines began to fear the ground itself. Every rock could hide a gun barrel, every shadow a sniper. Friendly fire incidents didn't help morale. In the confusion of smoke and sulfur haze, US artillery sometimes landed short. One infamous miscommunication involved a flamethrower team advancing while a nearby tank mistook them for Japanese defenders. The resulting inferno destroyed both the flamethrowers and the tank crew's sanity. Afterward, commanders doubled down on coordination efforts. Though mistakes still happened, war, as it turned out, was not known for being tidy. Despite the chaos, the Marines slowly gained ground. Mount Suribachi was now within reach. From the beaches below, troops could see its peak shrouded in smoke. Like an angry volcano god glaring down at them, the order went out, take the mountain. Historians still debate one key question. Did Kuribayashi plan to hold Suribachi to the very end? Or was it always meant as a delaying tactic? Some evidence suggests he withdrew key forces before the final assault, saving them for battles deeper inland. Others believe he simply ran out of men willing to die on the slopes. The truth may never be known. Suribachi's tunnels are still sealed in places, hiding their secrets. As dawn broke on February 23rd, Marines prepared for one of the most iconic moments of the war. A small team was chosen to climb the mountain and raise a flag, a symbol of hope for the exhausted troops below. They didn't know that their actions would become immortalized, or that they'd have to do it twice. For now, all they knew was that they had to get up that damn mountain without getting shot, buried, or set on fire. February 23rd, 1945, a date forever etched into history books. Iconic photographs, and more US US postage stamps than anyone could count. The morning was clear, the air thick with sulfur, smoke, and anticipation. Mount Suribachi loomed ahead, battered but unbroken, its slopes looking like they'd been personally designed by a sadistic rock climber with a grudge. For days, Marines have been clawing their way up the mountain, yard by painful yard. They weren't just fighting the Japanese defenders, they were fighting the terrain itself. The volcanic rock shredded boots and hands. While every cave and crevice potentially hit a machine gun, progress was so slow that one Marine joked, "At this rate, the war will end before we get to lunch." But finally, after relentless assaults, the Marines reached the summit. The mission was straightforward: plant the US-done flag to signal victory over Suribachi. What they didn't know was that they were about to create one of the most famous images of the entire war, and that it would take 2 tries to get it right. The first flag raising was small and improvised. A group of Marines, including Sergeant Ernest Thomas and Private First Class Harold Schreer, hauled a modest flag up the mountain. They jammed it into the volcanic rock and cheered as it unfurled in the breeze. Troops on the beaches below erupted in applause, their morale skyrocketing. For a moment, amid all the carnage, there was genuine joy. But here's the part most people don't know: that wasn't the flag raising, that was just the dress rehearsal. The commanding officer on the beach, seeing the tiny flag fluttering, decided it wasn't dramatic enough. "We need a bigger one," he said, probably while envisioning future history books. So, a second group of Marines was sent up with a much larger flag. This group included men whose names would become legend: Ira Hayes, Rene Gagnon, Harlan Block, Franklin Sousley, Mike Strank, and Harold Schultz. Photographer Joe Rosenthal was tagging along, camera ready. Contrary to popular belief, he didn't stage the photo. In fact, he almost missed it entirely. As the Marines scrambled to hoist the second, larger flag, Rosenthal snapped a single, perfectly timed shot. That image, 6 men straining together to plant the stars and stripes, would become one of the most enduring photographs of the 20th century. Ironically, at the exact moment the famous photo was taken, fighting still raged just yards away. Bullets were whizzing overhead, mortars exploding, and Marines dying. One participant later quipped, "If we'd known how famous it'd be, we'd have combed our hair." The confusion over the two flags caused chaos later. For years, there were disputes over who had actually been in the photograph. Some Marines were misidentified, while others were left out entirely. Families received incorrect information, medals were awarded to the wrong men, and bitter arguments ensued. It wasn't until decades later, with forensic photo analysis, that historians finally sorted it out. Even now, debates linger, a reminder that history isn't always as neat as the photos make it seem. While the flag raising inspired American troops and citizens back home, the Japanese weren't exactly moved. From their tunnels deeper in the island, they saw it as just another enemy gesture. Suribachi reportedly remarked, "Let them plant flags. They still have to fight for the rest." His point was well taken. Suribachi was only the southern tip of Iwo Jima. The real battle lay ahead. In the days following the flag raising, the Marines used the mountain as an observation point. From its heights, they could finally see the full scope of the Japanese defenses. It was not encouraging. The northern part of the island bristled with fortifications, and the tunnel network was even more complex than they'd feared. Suribachi had been hell. The rest of Iwo Jima promised to be worse. Meanwhile, back home, Rosenthal's photograph went viral 1945 style. Newspapers splashed it across front pages, calling it a symbol of hope and victory. War bond drives used it to raise millions of dollars. The image was so powerful that some people assumed the battle was over. Spoiler, it wasn't. The fight for Iwo Jima would grind on for another month, with casualties mounting on both sides. Here's a strange trivia nugget. One of the Marines in the famous photo, Ira Hayes, hated the sudden celebrity, a quiet, humble man. He struggled with being hailed as a hero while his friends were still dying on the island. His discomfort became so well known that it inspired songs, books, and eventually the Clint Eastwood film, Flags of Our Fathers. Hayes' story remains one of the most poignant examples of how fame can haunt as much as it honors. As night fell on February 23rd, the larger flag snapped in the wind over Mount Suribachi. For the men on the ground, it was a rare moment of pride amid the chaos. For Suribachi, it was just another day. His defenses inland were untouched, his men still ready. The battle was far from over, and both sides knew it. The flag might have been raised, but the true cost of Iwo Jima was only beginning to reveal itself. With the flag waving proudly over Mount Suribachi, many back home in the United States thought the battle was essentially over. The newspapers printed Joe Rosenthal's photo, war bond drives kicked into high gear, and Hollywood newsreels rolled out patriotic footage like confetti at a parade. Unfortunately for the Marines still slogging through Iwo Jima, the war wasn't finished, not by a long shot. In fact, things were about to get even uglier. Mount Suribachi was just the southern tip of the island. The northern half was a nightmare of ridges, ravines, and carefully concealed fortifications. Suribachi had saved his deadliest tricks for this part of the battlefield. Suribachi had been a symbol. The north was his masterpiece. The terrain alone was bad enough. The volcanic rock formed natural choke points perfect for ambushes. Every step forward meant climbing over jagged ground while being shot at from angles you didn't even know existed. The Marines nicknamed one area Meat Grinder, and they weren't being poetic, that's exactly what it felt like. Even tanks struggled to move, their treads grinding uselessly against the soft ash and sharp stone. But the real horror lay underground. The Japanese tunnel system, already infamous by this point, expanded into a labyrinth beneath the northern defenses. Entire battalions could move unseen, strike unexpectedly, and then vanish like smoke. Some tunnels were so elaborate they included living quarters, hospitals, and command posts. One Marine who stumbled into a captured tunnel swore it felt like walking into a small underground city complete with eerie silence and the faint smell of cooking rice. The tunnels created a psychological terror unlike anything most Americans had ever faced. You could clear a bunker, declare it secure, and 5 minutes later be shot in the back by someone emerging from a hidden passageway. It was like playing a game of hide and seek where losing meant instant death. Marines started to see the ground itself as an enemy, every shadow a potential ambush. To deal with this, U.S. Split Forces adopted a brutal routine: blow it, block it, burn it. Engineers sealed tunnel entrances with explosives whenever possible. Flamethrowers were used liberally, turning confined spaces into fiery tombs. Satchel charges, basically giant bags of explosives, were tossed into openings with the casualness of someone lobbing a beach ball. It was gruesome, exhausting work, and it still didn't guarantee safety. Sometimes, the Japanese defenders simply dug a new tunnel overnight. One surreal moment came when Marines captured a particularly complex tunnel system and discovered that the Japanese had rigged it with speakers. As the Americans explored, strange, disembodied voices echoed through the darkness. At first, everyone panicked, assuming it was some kind of supernatural warfare. Turns out it was just Kuribayashi's men using a primitive intercom to coordinate their defenses. Still, the experience was so unnerving that several Marines later admitted they'd rather face a machine gun than those ghostly voices again. Kuribayashi himself remained a mystery. Deep underground, he rarely revealed his exact location. Radio transmissions were minimal to avoid detection. Some captured Japanese soldiers didn't even know what he looked like. His strategy was simple but devastating, make the Americans bleed for every inch of ground. He understood that Japan couldn't win outright, but if he could inflict enough casualties, perhaps the US would hesitate before invading the Japanese home islands. This is where the battle shifted from conventional warfare to something far stranger. Marine patrols would advance by day, only to find the enemy had reoccupied the same ground by night. Snipers fired from impossible positions, sometimes from tiny holes barely large enough for a rifle barrel. Artillery shells seemed to come from nowhere. It was a deadly magic trick, and Kuribayashi was the magician. Historians still debate whether the Americans underestimated the tunnel system or simply couldn't adapt quickly enough. Some argue that intelligence reports had warned of extensive underground defenses, but planners ignored them in favor of optimistic timelines. Others believe no amount of preparation could have fully anticipated what they faced. Even today, unexplored sections of those tunnels remain sealed, silent reminders of a war fought beneath the earth. By late February, progress was measured in yards. Casualties soared. Medics worked tirelessly, their aid stations overflowing. The smell of sulfur mixed with blood and cordite, creating an unforgettable stench that veterans later swore haunted them for life. Sleep was a luxury. Marines often dozed sitting up, rifles in hand, ready to fire at the first hint of movement. One bizarre bit of trivia, some Marines began naming particularly troublesome tunnels after ex-girlfriends, bosses, or disliked relatives. Reports mentioned places like Betty's Revenge and Uncle Lou's Nightmare. It was dark humor, but humor nonetheless, a way to cope with the stress of fighting an enemy you couldn't see. As March approached, the reality set in Iwo Jima wasn't just a battle, it was a siege. The island itself seemed to fight back, every rock concealing danger, every cave hiding a new horror. For the Marines, victory was still possible, but it would come at a cost that few were prepared to pay. By early March, the fight for Iwo Jima had reached a phase the Marines politely referred to as utter chaos. On maps, the battle lines looked clean and organized, little blue and red arrows marching across the island like a tidy game of Risk. In reality, it was a tangled mess of overlapping units, random explosions, and men who weren't entirely sure if they were advancing, retreating, or just very lost. The US Navy was doing its part, or trying to. Massive battleships like the USS Iowa and USS New Jersey circled offshore, hurling shells the size of small cars into the island. When one of those monsters hit, the entire battlefield shook like a giant had stomped his foot. The idea was simple: keep blasting until nothing could possibly survive. Unfortunately, the Japanese defenders had other ideas, namely hiding in their tunnels until the bombardment ended, then popping back out like particularly violent prairie dogs. The result was a bizarre, almost comical rhythm boom. Alent, surprise gunfire. Repeat. Marines joked that the Japanese must have been on some kind of Union schedule break for shelling at noon. Back to shooting at 1, of course. No one was laughing too hard, especially when shells landed in the wrong place. Friendly fire was a constant risk. The smoke, confusion, and overlapping lines made accurate targeting nearly impossible. In one particularly infamous incident, a misread radio transmission led to a naval destroyer shelling a position still held by Marines. The commander on the ground frantically yelled into his radio, "Cease fire! Cease fire!" while a young radio man reportedly muttered, maybe say please. Later, when asked about the mishap, a Navy officer dryly commented, "Well, at least we hit something." This line became an unofficial catchphrase for the battle dark humor at its finest. Air support added another layer of chaos. Corsair and Hellcat fighter bombers swooped in to strafe Japanese positions, their engines roaring like angry chainsaws. When it worked, it was spectacular enemy bunkers reduced to rubble, Marines cheering. When it didn't, it was catastrophic. A few unfortunate runs ended with bombs dropped on the wrong coordinates. One Marine, diving for cover from friendly fire, reportedly shouted, "I signed up to fight the Japanese, not our own flyboys." The confusion wasn't entirely accidental. Kuribayashi had deliberately designed his defense to create maximum miscommunication. His tunnel network allowed Japanese forces to pop up behind American lines, fire a few devastating shots, and disappear again. Radio operators trying to report enemy positions often sounded like they were describing a bad horror movie. "They're behind us." "No, they're in front of us." "Wait, how did they get over there?" At night, the battlefield became even more surreal. Marines lit flares to illuminate the terrain, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move on their own. Japanese soldiers used the darkness to slip through the lines, sometimes planting explosives in supply dumps or sneaking into foxholes to silently kill sleeping men. The fear of night attacks became so intense that some Marines refused to close their eyes at all. Exhaustion set in, fraying nerves and tempers. One strange and haunting trivia nugget: a few Marines swore they heard singing in the distance during these night raids, traditional Japanese songs carried on the wind. Whether it was real or just the product of stress and sleep deprivation remains a mystery. Historians still debate it, with some suggesting it was psychological warfare, while others believe it was merely the mind's way of coping with unrelenting terror. Back at sea, coordination between the Navy and ground forces strained under the pressure. General Holland Howland "Mad" Smith had a notoriously fiery temper, and the radio operators on his ship lived in constant fear of his outbursts. During one particularly heated exchange about misdirected shelling, Smith allegedly shouted, "If I wanted my own men dead, I'd do it myself." No one was entirely sure if he was joking. Despite the confusion, the Marines slowly pushed forward. Progress was measured in feet, not miles. Entire platoons fought for days to capture a single ridge, only to discover that a tunnel underneath allowed the Japanese to retake it the next night. It was like playing an endless, bloody game of tug-of-war. To keep morale from collapsing, officers encouraged small rituals. Some units carried Lucky Charms coins, photos, even a battered deck of cards that supposedly always drew aces. Others invented absurd nicknames for terrain features. Places like the Amphitheater, Death Valley, and Sniper's Alley became common parlance. One particularly deadly zone earned the nickname the Bermuda Triangle, because anyone who went in seemed to vanish without a trace. Still, even dark humor couldn't fully mask the toll. By March 10th, American casualties were staggering: thousands killed, tens of thousands wounded. For a tiny island just 8 square miles in size, the cost was almost unimaginable. One Marine was overheard muttering, "At this rate, we'll need a whole new country just to bury our dead." Meanwhile, Kuribayashi remained an enigma. His forces were dwindling, but his strategy never wavered. Each Japanese unit fought to the last man, forcing the Americans to expend maximum resources on every encounter. Remarkably, there were still no massive bonsai charges, a stark contrast to earlier Pacific battles. Kuribayashi understood that suicide attacks wasted manpower. Instead, he relied on careful timing and psychological warfare to keep the enemy guessing. Historians still debate whether this restraint was purely tactical or also philosophical. Some argue that Kuribayashi saw his men as valuable assets, not disposable pawns. Others believe he was simply pragmatic, knowing that every Marine killed here might save 10 Japanese civilians later in the war. Whatever his reasoning, his approach made Iwo Jima unlike any other battle in the Pacific. As March wore on, the situation grew increasingly desperate. Ammunition and supplies ran low. Some Japanese soldiers resorted to eating grass and drinking sulfur-tainted water, yet they continued to fight with astonishing ferocity. For the Americans, victory was inevitable, but it was starting to feel hollow. One Marine summed it up best in a letter home: "We'll win, we have to, but some nights, it feels like the island's winning too." By mid-March, the Battle of Iwo Jima had crossed into a realm that even the most seasoned Marines hadn't seen before. It wasn't just a fight for an island anymore. It was a grim test of endurance, sanity, and sheer willpower. The Japanese defenders, now drastically reduced in number, were clinging to their positions with a level of desperation that defied belief. Kuribayashi knew the end was near, but he wasn't about to hand the Americans an easy victory. His strategy shifted from organized defense to chaotic, last-ditch resistance. Every remaining tunnel, every cave, every rock became a potential stronghold. Even as his men ran out of food and ammunition, they refused to surrender. For many, death was preferable to the shame of capture. The Marines, exhausted and running on adrenaline, were equally determined. They'd come too far and lost too many friends to turn back now. Progress was measured not in yards, but in bodies, and both sides were paying a staggering price. One infamous location was the northern plateau near Kitano Point, which quickly became known as the Meat Grinder. The name wasn't hyperbole in this area. Japanese machine guns and artillery created overlapping fields of fire so dense that Marines described it as walking into a storm of invisible blades. One veteran later said, "You didn't run through there, you prayed and hoped the bullets had bad aim." To advance, the Marines unleashed every tool in their arsenal: tanks, flamethrowers, grenades, satchel charges, even bulldozers rigged with armor plates to fill in trenches and seal off tunnel entrances. The sight of a bulldozer trundling into battle, covered in makeshift steel, was both ridiculous and terrifying, like a farm animal that had gone to war. And still, the Japanese held on. On March 16th, General Holland Howland Mad Smith announced that the island was secure. The statement was premature, to say the least. While the main defensive line had been shattered, pockets of Japanese resistance continued to fight with fanatical determination. Smith's declaration became a bitter joke among the Marines still dodging sniper fire and grenades. One weary sergeant reportedly said, "If this is secure, I'd hate to see dangerous." That night, as the sun set over the black sand beaches, Kuribayashi prepared for his final move. Knowing defeat was inevitable, he refused to order a mass banzai charge, something common in previous battles. Instead, he planned a carefully timed, coordinated last stand. His men would strike from multiple points at once, aiming to inflict maximum casualties before being wiped out. The attack came on the night of March 25th. Under cover of darkness, hundreds of Japanese soldiers emerged from hidden tunnels, slipping behind American lines. The initial confusion was total. Marines woke to the sound of screams and gunfire inside what they thought was safe territory. For nearly 3 hours, chaos reigned. Some Japanese soldiers attacked with rifles and grenades. Others wielded bayonets or even swords, turning the night into a surreal mix of modern and medieval combat. Marines scrambled to respond, often fighting hand-to-hand in the dark. One particularly bizarre report described a U.S.-spin private fending off an attacker with nothing but a shovel, later dubbing it his lucky blade. Despite the ferocity of the attack, the outcome was never really in doubt. By dawn, the last organized Japanese assault had been crushed. Of the hundreds who participated, only a handful were taken alive. Kuribayashi himself vanished into the chaos, his body never definitively identified. Some accounts suggest he died leading the final charge. Others believe he committed ritual suicide in a hidden tunnel. Historians still argue about his exact fate to this day. After the attack, the battlefield was eerily quiet. For the first time in weeks, the Marines could move without fear of sudden ambush. They had won, but at an almost unimaginable cost. Nearly 7,000 Americans were dead, with over 19,000 wounded. Out of roughly 21,000 Japanese defenders, only 216 were captured alive. The rest had fought to the death. One strange piece of trivia among the handful of Japanese prisoners was a soldier who had hidden underground for days, surviving on rainwater and raw fish. When asked why he finally surrendered, he reportedly said, "I ran out of fish." The interpreter didn't know whether to laugh or cry. The psychological toll on the Americans was immense. Many Marines struggled with what they had witnessed. They'd been told the battle was crucial and strategically. It was Iwo Jima provided a vital airfield for B-29 bombers and emergency landings. But for the men on the ground, the price paid felt almost incomprehensible. As one Marine put it in a letter home, "We've taken this island. I suppose someone somewhere thinks it's worth it. I just hope they're right." The Battle of Iwo Jima was over, but the scars physical and emotional would last a lifetime. When dawn broke on March 26th, 1945, the eerie quiet on Iwo Jima felt almost wrong. After weeks of non-stop explosions, gunfire, and screaming, silence was suspicious. Marines moved cautiously, fingers on triggers, half expecting another tunnel ambush. But for the first time since the landings, the island didn't fight back. Mount Suribachi stood smoldering in the distance, and the northern ridges, once bristling with fire, were finally still. Word began to spread through the ranks the battle was over. Except, of course, it wasn't, not entirely. Small pockets of Japanese soldiers still clung to life in the tunnels. Some were injured and delirious, others simply unwilling to believe the fight was lost. Clearing these last hideouts became a slow, dangerous process. Marines had to crawl through narrow, pitch-black passages, unsure if the next turn would reveal a surrendering enemy or a man with a grenade in each hand. A bizarre incident occurred during one of these final sweeps. A group of Marines stumbled upon a hidden chamber containing not soldiers, but a stash of unopened sake bottles. In a rare moment of levity, they celebrated by raising an impromptu toast, only to be interrupted by a sniper taking potshots from another tunnel entrance. It was the shortest party in Marine Corps history. One survivor later joked, "By now, the numbers told a grim story. Out of roughly 21,000 Japanese defenders, only 216 had been captured alive. The rest were dead, most having fought to the last man for the United States. The cost was staggering, nearly 7,000 killed and over 19,000 wounded. In other words, almost 1/3 of the Marines who landed on Iwo Jima were casualties." When word of victory reached the American public, it was framed as a triumph, and strategically, the airfields on Iwo Jima would soon be used as emergency landing sites for B-29 bombers, saving thousands of airmen's lives in the final months of the war. But for the men who fought there, victory felt complicated. Many wondered if the island had been worth the price. General Holland Howland "Mad" Smith, standing amid the wreckage, was blunt about what his men had endured. In a letter to Washington, he wrote, "This operation has been one of the most bitterly contested battles in Marine Corps history." Smith wasn't prone to understatement, and no one disagreed with him. One piece of little-known trivia: after the battle officially ended, Marines began to explore the captured tunnel network more thoroughly. In one section, they discovered an underground command room left almost perfectly intact. On the table were maps, teacups, and even a half-finished letter Kuribayashi had been writing. The letter's exact contents remain classified, though fragments suggest he had been reflecting on honor, duty, and the inevitability of defeat. Some historians believe he was preparing a final message to the Emperor himself. As Marines explored further, they also found evidence of just how disciplined Kuribayashi's forces had been. Supplies were carefully organized, medical facilities were well maintained, and even the ventilation system was ingenious. It was a stark contrast to the chaos above ground and a testament to how prepared the Japanese had been. Historians still debate whether the US underestimated Iwo Jima's defenses or simply miscalculated how determined the Japanese would be. Some argue that the intelligence was flawed from the start, with overly optimistic assumptions about how quickly the island could be taken. Others believe the real issue was cultural American planners couldn't fully grasp the Japanese mindset of fight to the death. The human stories were just as complex. Families back home saw Rosenthal's famous flag-raising photo and assumed it marked a clean victory. In reality, many of the men in that photo were already dead or would be within days. The image became a symbol of hope, but also of misunderstanding. Even among the survivors, there was little celebration. Marines packed up their gear, tended to their wounded, and began preparing for the next mission. There was no time to rest. Okinawa, an even larger and bloodier battle, loomed on the horizon. For Kuribayashi's part, his legacy became a subject of debate almost immediately. To the Japanese government, he was a hero who had defended the homeland with unmatched skill. To the Americans, he was a formidable adversary who had pushed them to their limits. His tactics would be studied in military academies for decades to come. One Marine summed it up best in his journal. "We took the island, but I'm not sure anyone really won. Iwo Jima belongs to the dead now." The smoke was still rising from Iwo Jima when the historians and politicians began to descend, not physically, of course, but through reports, photographs, and speeches for the men who had fought there. It felt surreal. A month ago, this had been a desolate, sulfur-reeking rock. Now it was the most famous 8 square miles on Earth. Almost immediately, myths began to form. Rosenthal's photograph of the flag raising became a national sensation, printed in newspapers across the country and turned into a massive war bond poster. Back home, Americans saw it as proof that victory was inevitable and that their sons' sacrifices had meaning. In Washington, officials praised the battle as a turning point in the Pacific War. But the reality on the ground was far more complicated. Many of the men in that photo were either already dead or would die before the campaign officially ended. The image didn't show the chaos, the screams, or the sheer scale of destruction. It was a symbol powerful, yes, but also incomplete. Kuribayashi's strategy fascinated military analysts. He had fundamentally changed how the Japanese fought in the Pacific by abandoning suicidal banzai charges and focusing on attrition and defense in depth. He inflicted unprecedented casualties on the US Marines. His decision to fight underground, using tunnels and interlocking fields of fire, was later studied by both American and Japanese officers. In some ways, Iwo Jima foreshadowed the tactics used in modern urban warfare. Yet Kuribayashi's fate remained mysterious. His body was never conclusively identified. Some accounts claimed he led his men in a final charge, sword in hand. Others suggested he died quietly in his command bunker, perhaps by his own hand. A few even speculated that he had escaped the island altogether, though that theory was mostly fueled by rumor and desperation. Historians still debate the truth, and probably always will. One of the most enduring controversies centers on whether the battle was strategically necessary. By the time Iwo Jima was invaded, Japan's air defenses were already crumbling. Some argued that the US could have bypassed the island entirely, saving thousands of lives. Supporters of the invasion countered that the airfields were essential for bomber escort missions and emergency landings. The numbers seem to support the latter view. Over 2,400 B-29 bombers used Iwo Jima as an emergency landing site in the final months of the war, saving an estimated 27,000 American airmen. But for the Marines who fought there, that was cold comfort. It was hard to weigh strategic value against the faces of fallen friends. A strange piece of trivia emerged in the years after the war. For decades, Japanese holdouts continued to hide in the island's tunnels, unaware that the conflict had ended. The last known group didn't surrender until 1949, 4 years after Japan officially capitulated. When they finally emerged, they were malnourished, confused, and still ready to fight. Their survival was both a testament to Japanese discipline and a haunting reminder of the battle's intensity. Today, Iwo Jima is remembered through memorials, museums, and movies. The flag raising has been immortalized in bronze at the Marine Corps War Memorial in Arlington, Virginia. Tourists visit the island occasionally, though access is tightly controlled. The tunnels remain mostly sealed, too dangerous and unstable to explore. They are silent witnesses, holding secrets that may never be revealed. For the veterans, memories of Iwo Jima never faded. Many spoke little of what they experienced, choosing to lock those memories away. Those who did talk often described the smell of sulfur, the black sand sticking to everything, and the sound of distant voices echoing through the night. As one Marine said decades later, "It wasn't just a battle, it was a world we lived in for a month, a world we never wanted to see again." The legacy of Iwo Jima is one of contradictions. It was both a stunning tactical success and a haunting human tragedy. It was a symbol of American determination and a showcase of Japanese tenacity. It was necessary and perhaps unnecessary, heroic and horrifying, all at once. And so the debate continues. Historians still argue over Kuribayashi's decisions, the invasion's necessity, and the meaning of that iconic photograph. But for the men who were there, the truth was simple. They fought, they bled, and they survived if they were lucky. The island remains silent and volcanic, as if holding its breath. The black sand remembers everything. The battle is over now. The gunfire has stopped, the tunnels are quiet, and the black sand lies still beneath the Pacific sun. What was once a place of unimaginable noise and chaos is now only an island, its volcanic slopes slowly healing beneath the salt air. For the men who fought here, there is finally rest. The screaming has faded into memory. The airfields built at such terrible cost now serve a different purpose, a landing place not for bombers, but for remembrance. Visitors walk carefully among the memorials, tracing the names etched into stone, listening to the whisper of the wind. It is easy to forget, amid the photographs and speeches, that every statistic was once a life. Each casualty figure represents someone's son, brother, or friend. And for the few Japanese soldiers who survived, there is no enemy now, only shared grief, separated by an ocean and decades of history. As you drift off tonight, know that the story has ended. There are no more ambushes waiting in the dark, no more desperate charges or hidden tunnels. The island sleeps, and so can you. The past remains where it belongs, deep beneath the sand. The world has moved on, as it always does. carrying the lessons forward while leaving the pain behind. Rest now, traveler. The battle is done, and the voices of the fallen are at peace. The ocean waves lap softly at the shore, carrying away the last echoes of war.